Babylon never falls. The system that survives. Even after the fall, Babylon never falls all at once. It rots while it seems eternal. It grows while it is already doomed. This story doesn't begin with ruins, but with gold, power, and promises that span centuries. The higher the empire rises, the more invisible its fall becomes. Nothing crumbles without warning. It simply chooses the right moment to show its face. When that happens, there is no return. No forgiveness. Never. Ever. For centuries, Babylon was treated as a distant myth, a dead city buried by the sands of time. But what if it never disappeared? What if its symbols, laws, and rituals merely changed form, traversing empires, religions, and power systems to reach the present? The deeper one investigates, the more connections emerge, revealing that the fall was never the end, but the beginning of something far more disturbing, hidden in plain sight, waiting for the right moment to fully reveal itself. The history of Babylon begins long before the prophecies and long after the ruins. It emerges as an idea, as a model of power that promises order while cultivating excess. Kings come and go, symbols remain, and the name Babylon transforms into language to describe systems that dominate without showing their faces. Observing its birth, we realize that we are not talking only about an ancient city, but about a pattern that repeats itself, silent, adaptable, and always ready to be reborn wherever there is enough ambition to sustain it. It is at this initial point that myth merges with reality, preparing the ground for everything that will follow. Everything was built to last, always attentive to power. Today. Over time, Babylon ceases to be a fixed place on the map and begins to exist as an invisible structure. Its walls are now ideas, its towers are institutions, and its strength no longer depends on armies. It learns to control desires, narratives, and beliefs, offering comfort in exchange for obedience. Those who live within this system rarely perceive the chains, because they are made of advantages and promises. Thus, the city grows without needing to expand physically, infiltrating different cultures, shaping values, and teaching that prospering is more important than questioning. The more it is accepted, the more untouchable it becomes, silently preparing the next stage of its influence. Gradually, Babylon learns that it doesn't need to be feared to rule. It becomes desired. Its values come to define success, freedom, and happiness, while any alternative is treated as backwardness. Seduction replaces force, and control is exercised through apparent choice. People believe they are free precisely because they choose what the system has already prepared for them. At this stage, the city doesn't demand declared loyalty, only the unconscious repetition of its customs. Questioning becomes strange, almost offensive, and the empire advances without resistance, fueled by the very acceptance of those who believe they are not part of it. At a certain point, Babylon begins to blend into normality. Its practices cease to seem like impositions and become tradition, repeated without reflection. What once caused strangeness is now celebrated as inevitable progress. Those who resist are isolated, labeled, or silenced, not by direct violence, but by subtle exclusion. Thus, the system protects itself by creating artificial consensus, where everyone seems to agree because disagreeing is too costly. The city doesn't need to destroy its enemies, only to make them disappear from the debate. It is in this manufactured silence that Babylon consolidates its most dangerous form, the one that remains standing precisely because no one believes it truly exists anymore. While Babylon thrives in this invisible state, something begins to wear away from within. The excess that once enchanted now demands constant maintenance, and the system needs to go further to sustain the illusion of stability. Values are inverted, limits are pushed, and what was once the exception becomes the rule. Not because everyone agrees, but because few dare to retreat. The city learns to feed on its own imbalance, transforming crises into opportunities for even greater control. Each failure becomes justification for more concentrated power, more surveillance disguised as care, more dependence. Thus, Babylon remains standing, not despite the chaos, but precisely because it has learned to profit from it. With this accumulated power, Babylon begins to rewrite meanings. Ancient words gain new meanings, truths become relative, and collective memory is constantly adjusted. The past is edited to serve the present, while the future is promised as a reward for conformity. At this point, the city no longer needs to convince, only to confuse. When no one knows for sure where the deviation began, it becomes impossible to point the finger at who is responsible. Guilt dissolves, and the system presents itself as the only viable alternative. Thus, Babylon strengthens itself not through clarity, but through the constant fog that prevents any complete vision, keeping everyone in motion, but without real direction. If this interpretation is making you rethink this story, leave a comment below with your perspective. These videos are meant to provoke reflection, and I read all the comments. And if this type of content interests you, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next ones. At this stage, Babylon no longer imposes visible rules. It automatically molds behaviors. Choices seem spontaneous, but they follow predictable paths, designed to keep everything functioning. Fear is not declared, but it exists in the possibility of losing status, security, or belonging. Thus, each individual begins to monitor themselves, adjusting their attitudes to avoid falling out of the flow. The city no longer needs walls or guards because it has been internalized. It lives in daily decisions, in accepted silences, in concessions made unconsciously. This is when Babylon reaches its peak, not as open tyranny, but as a comfortable consensus that no one dares to interrupt, even sensing that something essential has been lost in the process. But every system based on illusion begins to betray itself. Cracks appear at unexpected moments when promises are not kept and the shine fades. People begin to feel an emptiness that is difficult to explain, a feeling that following the rules no longer makes sense. Babylon responds by accelerating, demanding more adherence, more trust, more surrender, as if excess could hide the wear and tear. However, the more force it applies, the more evident the fragility it tries to conceal becomes. Control needs to be reinforced because it is no longer natural, and this constant need reveals that something fundamental is about to break. The city still seems powerful, but now it depends on continuous silence to avoid collapsing. It is at this point that the first signs of real rupture emerge. Not grand rebellions, but small gestures of refusal. Simple questions that find no honest answers. People begin to remember old values, not as nostalgia, but as an uncomfortable comparison. Babylon tries to absorb these flaws, transform them into fashion, discourse, or merchandise, but not everything can be recycled. Some ideas resist dilution and spread silently, almost imperceptibly. The system still controls the surface but loses depth. The city continues to function, but can no longer convince everyone that it is inevitable. For the first time, the promised eternity seems negotiable, and this is more dangerous for Babylon than any direct attack ever was. As this doubt spreads, Babylon begins to act with urgency disguised as normalcy. Everything needs to continue appearing stable, even when the foundation shakes. The system accelerates cycles, creates constant distractions, and replaces depth with volume. The more noise, the less space for reflection. Yet something has changed irreversibly, because those who see can no longer pretend they didn't. The city begins to lose its greatest asset, the illusion of absolute consensus. Each attempt to reaffirm control exposes the fear of losing relevance. Babylon was never maintained solely by power, but by the collective belief that there was no alternative. Now that belief weakens, and the empire feels the weight of depending on something it can no longer fully control. With this loss of symbolic control, Babylon reveals its last resort: absolute denial. Everything that threatens its continuity is labeled as exaggeration, a lie, or a danger. The city insists that it has always been this way, that nothing is wrong, that questioning is irresponsible. But this rigid stance creates visible cracks because it demands that everyone ignore their own experience. The more the official narrative distances itself from lived reality, the harder it becomes to sustain it. People begin to trust their perceptions more than the versions offered. Babylon still speaks loudly, but it no longer speaks alone. And when a system needs to shout to be believed, it has already lost part of the dominion it considered eternal. In this scenario, the fall ceases to be a future event and becomes an ongoing process. Babylon doesn't crumble with explosions or dramatic announcements, but with the slow erosion of the trust that sustained it. What once seemed solid begins to depend on excessive effort to continue existing. People no longer defend the system with conviction, only out of habit or fear of change. The city remains standing, but empty of meaning, repeating forms that have lost their content. It is then that it becomes clear that the true collapse does not happen in the buildings or institutions, but within the collective mind that has decided, even without saying it aloud, that it no longer believes in the promise that was sold to it. When Babylon finally loses its invisible power, it is not defeated by an external enemy, but abandoned internally. The system continues to exist, but without the emotional attachment that kept it alive. People move on, creating new meanings, new references, without asking permission. The city that seemed eternal discovers that its greatest weakness was always depending on the beliefs of others. Babylon never falls as a spectacle. It dissolves when it ceases to be desired, feared, or respected. And it is in this final silence, without glorious ruins or farewell speeches, that the most disturbing truth is revealed. The empire only existed because everyone agreed to keep it standing. When this invisible agreement ends, nothing remains but the echo of what was once called absolute power. If you enjoyed this approach and want to continue exploring stories that are almost never told this way, leave a like and subscribe to the channel. And now, click on the video that's appearing on the screen. It directly complements what you just watched and may completely change the way you see this story.